Good morning, class. Welcome to week 4. Today, I just want to take a few minutes to go over the mythologists that you all did your research projects on. Great job on that. I give everyone full credit. Um, as far as that goes, that is worth 10 points. This is the first kind of points we really assessed other than just attending. And if you have any questions about where you're at on that, feel free to email me. But I usually don't enter that grade, and it's under the participation grade, and until we get to the film reports, and then I usually enter it as all of them at once. But I can let you know what you get on any of those if you'd like to know. So I just want to take a second and try to develop and add on to what you research. And the first thing I'd like to say is that it's a huge task to research any of these, and these are complicated thinkers, and we could easily spend an entire semester on any of those thinkers and just on what they have to say about mythology or cultural hegemony. So I'm not expecting anyone to be experts on them, but I do want to kind of have you be a little bit familiar with them so that you can kind of see what's happened with the way mythology has been studied. And part of that is understanding cultural hegemony and how cultural hegemony plays in, especially to postmodern studies of mythology. And then as an advanced thing later in the semester, as you get more comfortable with giving your own interpretations on the meaning and cultural significance or cultural hegemony, I ask students to try to sprinkle in other theorists to support their own interpretations and so on. I don't recommend you try to do that at the beginning, because then what tends to happen is the other thinkers drown out your own voice, and I kind of want you to learn how to find your own voice and your own interpretations in this class before we get to that. Okay, so just briefly, I'm going to start with Freud and Deleuze. And as I mentioned in the instructions, the first is the modernist and the second is the postmodernist. And so we see the modernist tendencies under Freud, where he's he's finding the structure of the human psyche, right? Which for him is the id, ego, and superego, and how that creates the unconscious and so forth and so on. So we can see that structure. We can see the quest for essences, like in the Oedipal complex, which we'll talk about I'll talk about in a second, and then we'll talk about Deleuze, who wrote a book called Anti-Oedipus, in which he critiques Freud's ideas from a postmodern perspective. So real briefly, for Freud, the things to know: the id. The first that I want to start with is what Freud meant by the unconscious. Let's start there. So by the unconscious, Freud meant those things, those desires, thoughts, etc., that we have as animals, right? But which aren't permitted to be exercised within a civilization or a human society, right? And so one example of that is the Oedipal complex, right? And so id basically is the repository, in a way of speaking, of all of those taboo sexual desires and other kinds of taboos, etc., that aren't permitted to be acknowledged and exercised in public, right? And so for Freud, then, you have the id, the ego, and the superego. The id are all those desires we're born with, our instinctual desires, right? Some of which we can exercise, right? But many of which we have to repress, right? So that's important to note, so that for Freud, the way we repress them is by pushing them out of consciousness into the unconscious, right? And this is done through the superego and ego, right? And so the superego represents the societal ideals that nobody can really achieve, right? It's the ideal citizen, so to speak. and the id is represents all those things that can't be exercised in society. So the battle between those is the ego, which is the human individual. It's who we are. It's how we participate in society, right? And so what tends to happen is for Freud, there's a concept he calls sublimation. So say we have an id desire, and let's use the Oedipal complex, which is basically the idea that for a male, he has an attraction to his mother, a sexual attraction, and sees the father as a threat to him having access to the mother in that way. For the female, it's penis envy, and we won't get into all that, but it's a whole other conflict that arises for the female. And in both cases, male or female, these are desires that can't be expressed in public, right? So the superego says, no, you can't have those desires, right? So instead, what we have is through sublimation, as a male, we find someone who looks like mom, maybe, or acts like mom, and we marry her, and now we have a way to satisfy those id desires in a socially appropriate way, right? So the superego stepped in and reshaped those id desires into something that's socially acceptable. For Freud, that id desire remains, though, but it remains repressed in the unconscious. Okay, so and the Oedipal complex is an example of that. For him, that's a universal desire that shapes civilization, etc., that the superego represses into institutions such as marriage and heterosexuality, et cetera, and so on. Okay, so it's important to note that for Freud, then, myths are simply public dreams, and dreams are expressions of the unconscious. And if the unconscious represents those desires of the id, right, things that are repressed, then myth is a way of basically exercising and things that are within our id that society needs to be repressed. So it's the public repression. The function of myth, then, for Freud, is to help us repress those id desires that aren't socially appropriate and to reshape them using the superego into something that is socially appropriate, right? So the story of Oedipus Rex, then, for Freud, is a cautionary tale of what happens, right, if you follow through on that id desire, right? So that myth helps us repress that and become functioning citizens of whatever society. Okay, so Deleuze critiques this idea, and Deleuze critiques this idea on the basis of how Freud is defining desire as a kind of lack, right? So there's this id desire for something, and desire comes in the way often we think of it automatically. Right? I haven't had anything to drink for a while, so I have a lack of water, ergo, I desire water, right? So desire is rooted in lack. But for Deleuze, desire, he wants to argue that desire is proactive. Desire is a force, right? There's forces in the universe that say, be thirsty. There's forces in the universe that that say that attract you towards this and this. And he uses a concept called body without organs. That these different forces act on the body to channel desire in whatever way, right? And so it's not through lack; it's through this combination of forces, and power is what shapes those forces. And so one of his criticisms is that to the extent that there is an Oedipal complex, it's not universal, and in fact it comes and is shaped by societies, for example, capitalism. The idea of seeing dad ultimately for Freud, resolving that Oedipal complex is what shapes you into the heterosexual male you're supposed to be, and identifying with the father instead of the mother, is basically modeled in the workshop, right? Our boss. So we look at the father as the boss figure, and that is what's been being carried down. If it resonates with people, it's because social forces have put that desire there. So for for Deleuze, desire is we can even desire our own repression, for example. Um, and we can desire, and desire is productive, and that desire can create reality. How we see the world can be shaped through our desires. So social production is desire under determinate circumstances for Deleuze, right? So where Deleuze, so Deleuze then breaks from this modernist idea of having to structure the unconscious and the psyche, and says no, and he uses that concept of the rhizome that I introduced in last week's lecture, right? So the rhizome, such as tree roots or the internet network, right? There is no center to it, right? It's not a shape we can recognize. It's a constantly changing shape as new trees grow, as new internet connections, people log in, log off. It's constantly shaping and shifting, reshaping and shifting, and so forth and so on. That this is uh, reality, and so there is no center. There's no way we can unplug the internet and so forth. So instead, again, we can see that forces, different forces interacting with other forces to constantly have a world that's constantly becoming, right? And so, with that idea, the rhizomatic idea, it's critical of any sort of structuring of the unconscious. And then it brings in the idea against Freud, where Freud thought we're all rooted with a universal psyche. We all share the same basic structure in our human psyche. For Deleuze, there's no such thing as a human nature, you might say, because human nature is constantly changing. There's and shifting, etc., because of the work of all of these different forces. We can't separate human nature from the nature of everything around us. The air we breathe that is helps compose us, and of course, social forces, and most importantly, the forces of power that shape how we think and don't think, etc. So for Deleuze, you might look at the way he views human psychology as this huge, unlimited um, depository of possibilities, some of which are blocked because of society, others which are allowed to flow out and find expression, right? And one of those premier blockers is power, right? So that's his, and then I'm going to come back to society of control, which is his other important idea, but I want to introduce Foucault's society of discipline idea before I talk on that. Okay, so now I want to go to the next, which is Nietzsche and Foucault. So Nietzsche, we're going to start with the Apollonian and Dionysian. Here, the Dionysian, in fact, there's a story he tells about a character from the Iliad, who is basically um, visited by Odysseus and asked, "Hey, you have this. What is the best life to live?" This is a wise man who knows this. And he says, "The best possible life you can live is, no life, to not ever be born, right? And the second best is if you have to be born, to die quickly." So for him, this is Dionysian. This is the foundational reality of all things, which is suffering. That life is suffering, that existence is suffering, and that there's no such within the Dionysian, there's no such thing as identity. Everything is constantly in flux, right? Um, and so forth and so on. In this impossible to comprehend reality that we're all born into, that's much bigger than us, and that is where we can only be afraid of. So for Nietzsche, at a certain point, we realize that our destiny is not in our hands, that all the forces of nature, etc., are way bigger than puny little me, and will determine, like I'm a little speck of sand, so to speak, right? So that's the reality that we're all born into as babies, etc. But then, and that's the Dionysian myths. And so the myths of Dionysius and stories, myths that convey this kind of reality are for him the primitive, primordial myths that are out there that don't even need story form. But what happens is, in order to contend with that horrible reality, we invent things. And this is the Apollonian. We create forms, we give structure and shape to things. Suddenly, instead of just some indiscriminate and indifferent force, we give natural forces names, because then at least we can pray to them, say, hey, don't come with that tornado. If I'm nice enough, we can believe they'll favor us in some way, and we're not completely left alone and stranded. And so we create these Apollonian forms, is what he calls them, forms of poetry and narrative shapes of introducing a problem, climax, solution, etc. All of those sorts of things are the Apollonian forms of mythology. And he reaches an interesting conclusion here, because his criticism of Judeo-Christianity is that it is an anti-life mythology, right? That basically in Judeo-Christianity, and for Nietzsche, we could plug other things in here, such as Marxism or any sort of utopian sort of thought. The idea is you're only affirming life in its redeemed state, right? So the whole idea, he argues that Judeo-Christianity makes people hate the world as it is and long for the paradise to come, et cetera, and so on, right? And he argues that this is something that most societies contend with, but he argued that the Greeks found a way to come up with a mythology that could do two things. It could acknowledge reality, which is the Dionysian, and say yes to it, right? And for him, this was through this Apollonian Dionysian. He argued that the Greeks went so far with these Apollonian forms, etc., in creating individuals instead of just a collective mass that we're all swimming around in, is that it created an isolation of the individual that was even more horrific than that primordial goo that we were all trying to get away from. And so, because of the horror of that isolation, we go back to the Dionysian, but now we go back to it in all its horror and say yes to it. We look at it thankfully in some way, right? Now, it can be argued that whether that message can be reconciled with Judeo-Christianity or not. Lots of theologians have done so or tried to do so, but that's another issue. But that's the first point I want to make out there. And so because of that Apollonian Dionysian dichotomy that he found in the Greeks, and because he was critical of the world today with the cultural hegemony of his day, at least, which was dominated by Judeo-Christian myth, he determined that we needed a new mythology to lead us, to give us something that the Greeks had, a way to look reality in the face as it is and say yes to it. And so for him, that was Zarathustra. There is an actual Zarathustra in mythology. There's, from Zoroastrianism. That wasn't his. That's where he took the name from, but that's not what Nietzsche was doing. And so his Zarathustra is this figure that says yes to becoming, that says yes to things as they are, and dances and is, in his words, beyond good and evil, beyond judgment, and just looks at it and says yes. And so that's what I want you to kind of take from Nietzsche. And from there, Foucault, who actually, and we don't have time to go into this, but I lump those two together because Foucault took Nietzsche's method of study, which was genealogical instead of empirical, and adopted that to come up with his own ideas. And here, the two ideas I want you to get from Foucault are mainly biopower and society of discipline. So the groups all did a good job on all of these things. So some of this is repetitive. In fact, I think this class did better than most of my previous classes have done, because these are some complicated thinkers. But Foucault basically argued that traditionally, when we think of power, we always deal with the state. The state is power and everything else isn't. He said that's too simplistic. Power is multiple and diffuse, right? And he argued that there's different kinds of power besides what we usually think of power, which is violence and force or coercive power. So he argued that in, say, a lot of traditional societies, maybe coercive power was the primary method of obtaining obtaining hegemony, right? Which is, hey, you steal something, I'm going to chop your hand off, right? In other words, the threat of violence for doing something would repress the behavior, right? So in other words, power occurs through what Althusser, a thinker we'll talk about later, would call a repressive state apparatus. So power is attained by repressing certain behaviors, right? If you don't pay rent, you'll find everything out on the sidewalk, and you might go to jail if that debt is never paid or something like that, right? So it's repressing something you want to do and making you do instead making you do it the way it should be done, right? And so he said that that's not the only way that power works, though. It can also work through disciplinary methods. And a way I like to explain this is through a story by the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, and he tells a story about little Jimmy. And in the first story, that exemplifies coercive power. He has little Jimmy, and his parents come and say, "Little Jimmy, it's time to go to grandma's now." And little Jimmy says, "I don't want to go to grandma's. I'm having fun here with my friends. There's nothing to do at grandma's, and I'm going to stay here." And the repressive parents say, "Little Jimmy, get in the car." End of story, right? So that's repressive or coercive power, right? Now, in the second telling of the story, the parents handle it a little differently. Same question, it's time to go to grandma, same demand. But this time, when the little Jimmy says no, he doesn't want to, the parents handle it differently. They say, "Oh, well, you don't have to go to grandma's if you don't want to, but I thought we raised a better child than this. I mean, not a child who just wants to be selfish and play with his friends when his poor ailing grandma, who hasn't seen him in weeks, is sitting all alone and desperate to see him. And so, I mean, I didn't know we raised such a selfish child, but if you want to stay here," right? And so Zizek's point is that the second child also heard a command, but he heard not only one command, he heard two commands. Command number one, the same command the first child heard, which is, "You got to go to grandma's, get in the car," right? And command number two, "You got to like it." And this is done through discipline, through institutions such as education, work, family, etc., that convince people to want, to desire to behave, to want to do what they're supposed to do. So that's disciplinary power. And this led to his idea of biopower, which, as he describes it, is unlike coercive power, which is the threat of death. Disciplinary power is the threat to make live or to make produce. And so this is done, it can be through drugs, drugs for depression and stuff like that, that shape people in a certain way, and it can be done through ideology, right? Through, as in the example we just gave, for example. So that's disciplinary power, right? So real briefly, though, I want to go now back to Deleuze, and Deleuze expanded on Foucault's idea to come up with something he called moving from society of discipline to also society of control. And the best way of explaining society of control is that it works on our habits as opposed to defining behavior in a specific way through disciplinary practice, right? We have to teach it. For Foucault, the idea that we could be being watched reinforces good behavior and so forth. Deleuze came up with this idea that environment itself can shape behavior. The example I always give is, let's say we have 3 students in the class, and one of you is a diehard Trump supporter, another is all in with Biden, and another thinks either party is a mess and wants a communist revolution or something, right? So 3 very different people with 3 very different ideologies, but if you go downtown, all 3 of you behave exactly the same way. Why? Well, there's a street light. I can't just walk out of the street or I'll get killed. So I wait for the street light. I walk across. I walk at the crosswalks, not in the middle of the street, right? So in other words, the environment determines how I behave, right? And that goes beyond someplace like downtown, but Facebook, where I can like or have a sad face or whatever, it determines how I respond, how I react. Twitter, where I can I can give like 3 sentences, but I can't write a whole essay. So all of these technologies shape our behavior. They also put us in a sense where we're constantly um, performing or constantly surveilled, right? We can always now, there used to be a time where, if you didn't pick up the phone, your boss couldn't contact you, right? To say, hey, come into work. Now you can always be contacted. So there's that. And so you're having to check email and things of this nature. All of these things plug into this idea. And then just how different things are defined. If I throw a ball at you, chances are you catch it, right? So in a certain sense, you have been that society of control. There's no reason you have to catch it instead of punch it, but we've been taught that balls are things you catch, right? And so that codifies our behavior. That's done on a lower level. We don't have to think ideologically, right? At all. More and more of our lives are shaped by the technologies around us and so forth to make us behave in a certain way. So all of those things, society of coercion, society of discipline and control, come into play because one of the arguments for this class, one of the arguments is made is that um, myth-based cultures are usually focused on coercion, right, and a little bit on discipline. But today, one of the reasons that we might be less of a mythology-based culture than we've been in the past is because of society of control. Ideology no longer matters. It doesn't matter how you think. I control your behavior anyway, right? Through massive surveillance, right? So we see how, for example, algorithms have really determined probably the last 4 presidential winners as who had the best um, uh, I forget the name for it. Anyway, information processors or whatever. There's a word for it that'll come to me after I finish this lecture. um, but yeah, those sorts of the data analysis and that sort of thing has kind of determined our behavior in ways that bypass ideology and discipline as well as coercion. Okay. All right. So now I want to go to the final group, which was Jung and Hillman. So the thing about Jung, the main thing to note here, Jung was a student of Freud, but the main thing to note about Jung is that he defined the unconscious in a very different way. Both Jung and Freud thought myths were representations of the unconscious, but we've already talked about how for Freud that meant representations of things that are repressed, the id. But for Jung, the unconscious are things that we inherit, right, from not only our cultural traditions, but we inherit them physically too, as archetypes, is what he calls them. And so, what's important about this is that for Freud, myth helps us repress things that society demands be repressed. But for Jung, we should tap in to the unconscious so that we can become more psychologically healthy through a process of what he calls individuation. And individuation is the process by which the different archetypes are assimilated and collected into a cohesive sense of self, right? And there are 5 main ones that he focuses on, which are persona, ego, shadow, anima or animus, depending on the gender of the protagonist, and self, right? Those 5 archetypes need to be reconciled and come together in such a way so that you feel psychologically healthy and complete and whole, right? And so that was his main contribution to both Freudian analysis and psychology, but also to myth, right? And created a very different function for myth. Now, the function of myth is not to help us to repress, but to help us assimilate and individuate to become healthy, right? So Hillman, a postmodernist, right, took that same idea of the archetypes and roughly that same definition of the unconscious, but he took it in a whole new direction, which is consistent with postmodernism, which is to say, instead of focusing on what he accused Jung of doing, monotheistic psychology, of producing a cohesive centered self, he says, no, those archetypes are there, but those archetypes should be looked upon as mirrors in the same way we look at, say, friends as mirrors. When we make a new friend, often we learn things about ourselves that we didn't know before, right? While simultaneously seeing ourselves. That person likes us because, and we like them because they like something about us that we like about ourselves, etc. We also see ourselves in a new way because of that friendship or that relationship or whatever. For Hillman, this is what um, archetypes do. So they don't help us individuate because there's no such thing. That's um, a delusion for Hillman. So instead, what's the purpose and function of myth and archetypes is, in his words, to help us beautify, right? To grow and expand and develop. So in this process of becoming, the archetypes will give us insights into ways that we will not be trapped by certain ideologies and power structures, etc., that can continue to grow and um, and not so much be fulfilled as expand in our complexity and so on. So there are a number of quotes that we could give from Hillman that I think illustrate that, but I want to rush things a little bit so as not to keep you here too long. But that's his main idea. And acorn theory is his idea. He puts this forth as a mythology, which is to say, as a kind of another archetype. His acorn theory, which is the idea that all of us, like an acorn is destined to become an acorn tree or not, but it's not destined to ever become a mountain or a car, an automobile or something, right? So in a similar way, human beings are born like an acorn with a certain destiny. So there are certain places they can go, and the archetypes will help us fulfill that. They will help us grow in those directions that equate with our destiny. But then the thing to note here is even the acorn theory works in the same way that an archetype does, not as a preconceived description of reality, but as a mirror to help us grow and expand and beautify, in Hillman's words. Okay, so finally, in those last thinkers, Joseph Campbell, I think you did a really good job of seeing how Joseph Campbell was influenced by Freud and by Jung and by Nietzsche, and you're right, because he was a modernist. And we'll talk about the critique of him in just a second, of the modernist approach a little bit more in a second, and we've already discussed it a little bit in last week's lecture. But we can see how those ideas go into Joseph Campbell and produce what he calls his monomyth. So for Joseph Campbell, there are three different categories of myth, but the big one is the hero's journey, or which he calls the monomyth. And so all these adventure stories, epic poems, etc., in Campbell's mind are really the same myth, right? And so the critique of that is so in other words, they follow this exact same structure. He's identified and discovered the structure of one of the three forms of myths that are available, and the other structures as well, but that's the most important and significant one. The critique of that by the postmodernists is, hold on, wait a second. First of all, you're being ethnocentric. You're a white male European telling these telling the Yoruba people in Africa and telling the Native American, Navajo or whatever in the Americas what their myth means, right? So in doing so, you're being imperialistic and you're redefining what those myths actually mean by saying it's the same structure and ergo the same overall meaning, right? And so the postmodernists, such as Bruce Lincoln and Karen Doniger, and again, it's harder to find their influences from those other thinkers, and not many of you commented on them, but that's where they go with this. And again, Hillman is another postmodern mythologist. We can see how he took Jung's ideas, of his structuralist ideas, and made them into something that's non-structural, and his idea of polytheistic archetypes, right? To help us expand. They're not things we need to collect together, but to grow. And so the same thing occurs with both Doniger and Bruce Lincoln. Many of you mentioned Lincoln's idea that myth is ideology in narrative form. So ideology, by Althusser's definition, what ideology means is that ideology is the way power tells us to imagine reality, right? So it's the imagined relationship we have to our real conditions of experience, right? So the imagined reality of work is that we've got a good job that takes care of our families, and we get our weekends off, etc. That's the imagined reality, and we're lucky to have that, and grateful to our bosses for giving us this job, etc. The reality is that um, the value we produce from our labor is stolen from us from our bosses, that we're forced to work because we're not part of the ownership class, and that most of us work jobs that are not only very insignificant and not very important, some bullshit jobs, to use the recently deceased David Graeber's terminology, bureaucratic jobs, etc., that really don't matter. Um, and the jobs that don't matter much, and they're boring and repetitive and often mind numbing in some way. So Althusser would argue that's the real condition. That other stuff is the ideology, right? And so for Bruce Lincoln, myth is ideology. It's teaching us to look at reality and put this, sexy veneer over top of it so that it's more tolerable to us, and so that we accept those conditions more readily and are less likely to revolt and try to change things through collective resistance or something. So that's the main thing we need to note from these postmodern mythologists, is that the emphasis has changed. For modernists, finding the structure of the psyche was important, using it for those colonial purposes we talked about in last week's lecture, right? For the postmodernists, the major reason for studying myth is to learn about cultural hegemony, to see what those myths tell us about ideology, and to see the way those myths reshape our thoughts and convince us to believe things that aren't true, brainwash us, in other words. In other words, myth is propaganda. One thing I'll argue in this class is that without question, myth is propaganda. There's really no reasonable reason to debate that. But what is debatable is whether or not that's the only thing myth is. And I would argue that it's not. I would argue that myth does more than just reinforce cultural hegemony. But the way to get there, and this is Karen Doniger's idea, Karen Doniger argues that yes, there are universals that we can find within myths, universal truths in certain ways. There are certain things that humans have in common with one another, and so forth and so on. But you find them by going from the bottom up, not by starting with your ideology and imposing it on everything below it, but by starting, and for starters, not being ethnocentric, looking at the myth from the perspective of the people who created the myth, from the Yoruba people, from the Navajo, whatever, and looking at it from their perspective, right? And seeing what it means for them first before you try to find other meanings beyond it, right? And then you can find universal qualities in myth as long as you start from the ground up, not with your thesis that you then impose, right? One thing it doesn't really work to do it remotely, but to exemplify this point, in my in-person classes, what I do is I have you go listen to some lyrics in a Led Zeppelin song, and I have you listen to them backwards and ask you what it says. and and you can do this. You can probably find, because I stole it from somebody else anyway. But usually somebody hears a Satan or something like that, and maybe a sexy or something. And then I say, okay, we're going to listen again, but this time what you're going to hear is, oh, here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose path has made, etc. And I give you a whole paragraph of what you're going to hear. Sure enough, everyone hears it. And what's happened is not that there were messages encoded in backwards in the lyrics of that Led Zeppelin song. What happened is that you're hearing a bunch of noise, and I gave you a pattern to look for, right? And what science tells us is that the worse the sound quality is, the easier it is to hear what I'm telling you you're going to hear, right? So in other words, I have those expectations I've given you are going to be self-confirming, right? And so scientists try to overcome this with placebos and other things, right? These kinds of biases. But the postmodern critique of modernism is exactly that's what Joseph Campbell and other modernist mythologists are doing, is that they're taking these ideologies, or they're taking these broad narratives and making people expect to find them, and sure enough they do, right? And so we want to ensure that we don't do that in this class, and we are going to take more of a postmodern look at these myths, but that doesn't mean we're going to throw out all of the modernists. And there's a lot we can learn from modernists as well. As I mentioned in last week's lecture, it's not so much of two dueling and clashing worldviews as it is modernists and then people who studied those modernists who evolved modernism into postmodernism, right? In the same way that Newton's ideas were expanded on and became Einstein's ideas and then led to particle physics, etc. Right? So it's that kind of thing. And so with that in mind, your assignment for this week is we're going to start now practicing this. For the modernist approach is to emphasize the similarities for reasons that should be obvious. They're looking for those common structures and essences, right? One thing that even postmodernists will look at is you can do that and still look at cultural hegemony, right? We can look at things of say, the myths of a primitive culture and show how they're similar to the myths of a so-called advanced culture. And in doing so, we can overcome the sort of ethnocentric biases of the alleged superior culture to show that there really isn't that superiority. There really isn't this evolution of cultures that the early mythologists pretended there to be. So we can do that, and certainly it's still valuable to look for similarities amongst myths of different peoples, and so we'll do some of that in this class. But then the other approach from the postmodernists is called particularist. It's to focus on the differences and to single out those differences, and in terms of seeing what they tell us about the differences in those cultures and the power structures and the social bases, the mores and behaviors, etc. In other words, the cultural hegemony of those cultures and how that works. And as we advance into the semester and get to the films, we'll be applying that to our own culture. One of the arguments that Bruce Lincoln makes is that it's really easy, or it's really difficult, rather, to find the cultural hegemony of your own culture because you're kind of like that second little Jimmy. You are part of the culture. You've been, Althusser's word here is interpolated. You've been made a subject of that culture and given certain desires, beliefs, and so on, so that you don't see it as power influencing you. You just see it as you being you, right? But by finding how power and cultural hegemony works through the myths of other cultures, we can then apply that to our own culture in such a way to make the invisible visible, right? So one of the arguments of the postmodernists is that really effective cultural hegemony is invisible, right? Once you start seeing it, it's a sign that it's starting to break down. So that might be applicable to things that are going on in our country at present, as maybe some of that is becoming more and more visible. And so we'll deal with that a little bit. So, and the first one we're going to deal with, and we'll get started on this assignment this week, but we won't finish it until next week, is to look at a specific myth, which is the myth of Daedalus. And so I'm going to just briefly tell you that story, and then we'll leave the rest of that for later. And what we're going to do is, in preparing ourselves for an analysis of this myth, we're going to look at the Greek pantheon, and that's available to you in the assignments tab on D2L. And a few things about that. so look those over and those basic gods. But basically, it starts with the creation myth, which is Hesiod in ancient Greece, which there are four different forces, right? Um, and they're all dark, chaos, darkness, Gaia, which is Earth, and Tartarus, and which are they're very dark forces that come together and create the first generation of gods, known as the Titans. And one of the things the Titans do with the Titans is that the chief there, Uranus, is overcome by his son, and he's castrated, which is where we get Aphrodite later on. And so this introduces something very important for Greek culture, which is the concept of patricide. If power is male, is patriarchal, then to obtain power, you have to overcome the male who has it. And so this becomes the kind of way power regenerates itself. It's through patricide. We see that in the myth, right? So in that first generation of the gods with the Titans, Cronus, the one who castrated his father for good reason, he starts to have kids with his sister Rhea and starts to worry that his kids might do to him what he did to his father, because they get older and more powerful and want power for themselves. So to prevent that from happening, he starts eating all the kids. And as a result, so he starts eating them, and then one of his sons, Zeus, with the help of his mother and the husband of Cronus, manages to trick Cronus into eating a rock instead of eating Zeus. And depending on the version, either he grows up in a cave till he's strong enough to take on his dad, or he does it right away. He overcomes his father and becomes the new ruler of the gods, and this ushers in the generation that we're most concerned about, which are the gods of Olympus. And those are the 12 gods of the Greek pantheon that are in that PowerPoint that is in the assignments tab. Okay, so a few things about Greek culture, some of which you've already kind of explored in your assessments early on. So one thing that you'll note is the concept of hubris. Aristotle defined a human as a person who lives within a polis, an animal who lives in a polis, right? So if you don't live in a polis, you're just an animal, right? But if you try to be more than an animal who lives in a polis, then you're a god. The appropriate way to be human was to be a human, right? And to try and go further was hubris, and you would be punished for that. And being less than human would also get you punished within the animal world, and it would lead to sacrifices and stuff like that. And then the other thing to note too, as I've mentioned, it's a patriarchal culture, maybe one of the most misogynist cultures in history that at least I'm aware of. Yeah, it's very interesting because many of the myths, especially the Greek tragedies that develop later, feature female protagonists. It's almost the equivalent of, say, going back to America in the early 1800s and seeing this art form emerge in which Black slaves are the protagonists and heroes of every story. So it's a little bit contradictory in a certain sense. But one thing we'll explore is exactly kind of how that works with different myths, and how that serves to actually reinforce the cultural hegemony of patriarchy rather than the reverse. It's not really the threat. It might seem to be. So anyway, with that in mind, go ahead and look at that pantheon and the story of Daedalus. Then I feel like I'm going on too long here, but I'll try to be brief. So it begins with in the Isle of Crete. The past king has just died, and his three sons are vying for the throne. And in order to win this contest, one of the competitors for the throne prays to Poseidon, the god of the sea, to send a sign showing that he's the rightful heir. And the sign he sends is a beautiful white bull. But as the rules go, when the gods send you something, what they're doing is that's meant to be sacrificed. the whole idea of a sacrifice is making something sacred through the act of killing it and giving it back to the gods. And what the king did is he sacrificed an inferior bull in its place because he was so enamored with this wonderful bull. So that meant he was cursed. And the curse in this case, when Poseidon found out that the king was not obeying his orders, the curse was through his wife, Persephone. And he caused the bull, he caused his wife to fall in love with the bull and seek its favors. And this became problematic because she was a human and the bull was a bull. And so what she did is she sought help from the great famed inventor Daedalus. And what Daedalus did is he created a mechanical cow by which she could go out into the pasture, so to speak, and the white bull would see her and come and they would do their thing and she would have her desire satisfied. And the result of this was the monster, right? Half bull, half man. The so-called Cretan bull in some stories, or I'm blanking on the Minotaur, or the Minotaur, right? And the Minotaur, like most monsters, it didn't eat a normal diet. Its diet consisted of humans, and so 7 humans would have to be sacrificed to the bull every year. That leads us to a whole other story about Theseus that we won't get into. But the bull was imprisoned inside of a labyrinth that Daedalus also made. And part of the story with Theseus is that Theseus was one of those 7 to be sacrificed. The king's daughter helped Theseus to navigate the labyrinth and to kill the Minotaur. And as a result, he now, and there are different versions of the story, but in one, he found out what had happened to create the Minotaur in the first place and to punish Daedalus. In other versions, it's so that nobody else would learn the secrets of the labyrinth. He imprisoned both Daedalus and his son inside the labyrinth. And so now they're imprisoned there. There's only one route of escape, and that's straight up. And so Daedalus, because he's a famous inventor, he develops a set of wax wings and for him and his son. And he gives his advice. He gives some advice to his son, which is, don't fly too low because then the winds will make it impossible to fly. And don't fly too high because then the sun will melt the wax on your wings and you'll plummet to your death. But being a rash youth, Icarus, his son, flies higher and higher. He's having a great time, loses track of the danger. The wax on the wings melts and he plummets to his death. Daedalus, then, seeing what's happened, takes refuge on another island where he immediately gives sacrifice to Apollo, the sun god, who was kind of responsible for the death of his son in a way, ergo kind of making amends. And then he's taken in on another island by another king later when Minos, that's the king that of Crete, when Minos comes to kill Daedalus, finding out that he's escaped and is alive, this new king and his daughters conspire to make sure that that doesn't happen, and Minos is killed as a result. So that's the story of Daedalus and Icarus. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a modernist reading of that through the lens of Joseph Campbell's monomyth and compare it with another story of Simpati and Jatayu, an Indian and from Hindu mythology, and we'll find the similarities and so forth. And then what you all will do is you'll do a particulars analysis, but you'll do it through some different versions of that same myth, which will be, in this case, visual versions, 2 different paintings. So all of that will be explained later. I just wanted to kind of give you the story, and probably I'll link, and I'm going to link to that story as well. I probably wasted my time telling it, but I wanted to tell it because the whole one idea of myth is that it's meant to be conveyed orally, not through text and other reasons, because those are not democratic means of conveying myth. Therefore, they're not really the voice of the people. So I wanted to try and convey that version of it orally as best I could. So anyway, look for the introductions for that assignment. So the assignments for this week, 1 will just be to watch this video, and 2, to respond with a question or comment. And then I'll kind of introduce the assignment for that we won't complete until next week, which is doing this analysis of the myth of Daedalus. I also want to mention that we are now going to get into some of the readings in the text. So by next week, you'll want to have read Goose Girl and the Epic of Gilgamesh. So we'll start doing it now after we do our analysis as a group for the Daedalus myth. We'll have you all kind of do some analysis of that, and those will be followed by lectures in which I give my own analysis of them as well. So hope everyone's doing well. I hear we're in for some fall weather coming soon, and I can't wait. So hope you're all doing well, and it looks like we got a good class this semester. I kind of regret that I can't see your faces in person and so forth, because it looks like we got a pretty good group. You've been doing good work so far on the assignment. So keep it up, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.